Eventually, helped by his twin sister, Princess Ashraf, and encouraged by words and deeds of support from the American government, the Shah succeeded in helping Kazım overcome the Azerbaijan crisis, and then ridding himself of the meddlesome prime minister. After Kazım's trip to Moscow, a trip he hailed as a great success, he began to negotiate not only with the Russian embassy in Tehran, but with a delegation from the Azerbaijan province led by Jafar Peshawari. A few weeks after Kazım's return, Soviet troops began to leave Iran, easily a key development in the resolution of the crisis. By then, Peshawari had a full-fledged cabinet and increasingly acted as a head of state. His office title was Prime Minister, while other provinces in Iran had governors. His government was also acting more and more like an independent state. Units of the Iranian army had been disarmed and dismissed. Iranian postage stamps were overprinted with the words Azerbaijan National Government, 21 Azar 1234, and before long a new flag appeared over government buildings in Tabriz. Finally, in a gesture that captured poetically and politically where the heart of the new Azerbaijan government was, it adopted Moscow time half an hour behind Tehran. The Shah began his plans for dismissing Kazım first by opposing Kazım's attempt at appeasing the Soviets and reaching a rapprochement with Peshawari. But he waited for the Soviet army's departure from Iran before making his move against Kazım. The fact that Kazım had chosen his vice premier and propaganda and labor minister, Mozaffar Ferouz, as his chief negotiator with Peshawari made it politically easier and more emotionally appealing for the Shah to fight the agreement. Ferouz had long openly ridiculed and criticized the Shah, and in return the Shah developed a lifelong, visceral hatred of the man. Even long after the end of the Azerbaijan crisis, when the Shah was at the height of his power, and figures like Ferouz were altogether marginalized, his obsessive hatred of Ferouz did not dissipate. Moreover, in 1946, the Shah's ability to oppose any agreement reached by Kazım was augmented by the fact that by then Ferouz was considered a spokesman of a pro-Soviet element in Iran, outdoing the Tudeh party itself. On June 13, 1946, with much fanfare, Kazım announced that Ferouz had finally succeeded in resolving all outstanding issues between the central government and Peshawari. The claim was far from the truth. Many apparently intractable issues, including the nature and limits of the autonomous region's power, were left unresolved. But by then, with the Soviet troops gone, Peshawari felt more vulnerable and had softened some of his views and his rhetoric. In his own words, Western pressure on the Soviet Union, what he called his big friend, had changed the landscape. In reality, while in Tehran, Peshawari received a long, surprisingly harsh letter from Stalin, reprimanding him for his overzealous revolutionary rhetoric. Iran and Azerbaijan are not in a revolutionary situation, Stalin said, adding that we could no longer keep Soviet troops in Iran mainly because of the presence of Soviet troops in Iran undercut the foundations of our liberationist policies in Europe and Asia. The British and Americans said to us that if Soviet troops could stay in Iran, Then why could not the British troops stay in Egypt, Syria, Indonesia, Greece, and also the American troops in China? Therefore, we decided to withdraw troops from Iran and China in order to unleash the liberation movements in the colonies. In spite of the remaining intractable issues between the two sides, both Peshawari and Kavam had to pretend progress was being made in the negotiations. Peshawari, because Stalin had ordered him so often his position, and Kavam for two different reasons. He had promised Stalin he would resolve differences with Peshawari, and moreover, some Western diplomats at the time believed that Kavam had calculated that his position as prime minister was guaranteed only so long as the negotiations continued. The Shah, he knew, was trying to get rid of him and prolonging the negotiations with the Soviets, and Peshawari, while showing some progress, was one way to stay in power and block the Shah's moves. The Shah was equally resolved to derail the agreement and depose Kavam. Was it likely that the proposed agreement with Peshawari would, as Kavam and the supporters suggest, pave the way for a more democratic, federal Iranian government? Or would it set the nation on the slippery slope that would end in secession? While it is possible to answer this question with certainty, the fate of the people's republics of Eastern Europe makes it far more likely that Iranian Azerbaijan would have soon followed a similar fate and disappeared behind the Iron Curtain. The Shah focused his opposition to the agreement by adamantly opposing the part stipulating that the Azerbaijan army will be incorporated into the Iranian army. As the Shah never tired of repeating in future years, he had told Kavam that he would prefer to have his hand cut off than to sign such a decree. For several reasons, the Shah's opposition, key amongst them, Kavam's negotiations with the Peshawari government collapsed. By then, Kavam had seen the writing on the wall. His plans for some kind of oil concession to the Soviets and an autonomy agreement with the Peshawari government were no longer a possibility, and he declared himself fully in agreement with the proposed operation by the Iranian military to retake Azerbaijan. On December 11, 1946, the Iranian military, commanded by the Shah and General Haj Ali Razmara, entered and reoccupied the province of Azerbaijan. Before Iranian forces began to move, the Soviet embassy in Tehran, the Tuda Party, and Peshawari's propaganda department, one threatening war, another promising resistance to death, and the Tuda Party offering full support to the Peshawari government, tried to deter Kavam, and the Shah from going through with the planned military operation. But both men, albeit for different reasons, held firm. In spite of the revolutionary bombast of Peshawari and his comrades, "There is death, but no retreat," they had famously announced. Once Iran's military began to move into Azerbaijan, there was little serious resistance. The radical zeal of some of Peshawari's policies, the heavy-handed approach of the Soviet advisors, and the exiles who had returned home with the Red Army, the Mujahars, combined to create the terror that gripped Azerbaijan at the time. This terror had by then sapped what early enthusiasm there was amongst the people, and had made the ruling party weak and isolated. Before the military operation, more than once, the Shah had made reconnaissance flights over enemy-held territory, often in old planes, sometimes in small, twin-engined Beechcraft, and always without a radio. With no Soviet army to prop them up and no people to support them, the Democratic Party of Azerbaijan collapsed sooner than anyone had imagined. Less than 24 hours after the invasion, the party conceded defeat. In the morning, the Democratic Party's official organs had called on people to resist the attackers, and around 8 o'clock in the evening, the same organs asked people not to fight the Iranian army. It has been estimated that during the first stage of the operation, 500 people were killed on both sides. On the second day of the military operation, the Soviet ambassador requested an emergency meeting with the Shah. He marched into the room and angrily demanded an immediate end to all hostilities. Unbeknownst to him, by then the Shah had already received reports that the Azerbaijan government had collapsed and surrendered. With glee in his eyes, the Shah showed the incredulous ambassador copies of the reports from the region, indicating that the hostilities had ended. Reports from citizens of Tabriz at the time, written on the day the military operations began, indicate that from early morning, as soon as people heard the Iranian army was on its way, they began to attack, disarm, and at times execute members of the Azerbaijan government, particularly the much despised Mujahars, who had invariably been the most brutal in suppressing the people. Even earlier, people had shown their disgruntlement with the more radical policies of Peshawari's comrades by celebrating with more than usual fanfare the birthdates of Shiite imams. In solving the Azerbaijan crisis of 1946, the Shah was helped by a number of factors. On the one hand, he had come to believe that his decisions were really inspired and decided by that mystical power to which he felt he owed his career. Ironically, even Kazım is reported to have occasionally engaged in the religious ritual called istikhara, in which the devout use either the Quran or their worry beads to consult God, but about the wisdom or the likelihood of an action. More secular Iranians use the Hafez Divan for the same purpose, opening it to a random page, reading the Ghazal sonnet on that page, and finding from it a guide to heaven's designs. In Kazım's case, when faced with a dire decision like Azerbaijan, he used the worry beads he invariably carried in his pocket to find out what God wanted him to do. It was the Shah, told one of his authorized biographers, divine intelligence that directed his actions and even determined their timing. His policies in the Azerbaijan crisis, no less than any other of his decisions, were in his mind part of his mystical life and the mission ordained for him by higher powers. In less spiritual moments, the Shah attributed Iran's ability to get the Soviet Red Army out of the country, incidentally the only time the Soviets were forced to give up a territory they had occupied, at least partially to Truman's frank and stiff notes to Stalin, demanding Soviet evacuation of its forces from Iran, years later in a press conference on April 24, 1952. Truman himself claimed that he had to send an ultimatum to Stalin to get its forces out of Iran. Later the same day, a White House spokesman clarified Truman's declaration by saying that the president was using the term ultimatum, ultimately in a non-technical sense. Truman further claimed that the U.S. message sent to the Soviet Union was the major factor in bringing about Soviet withdrawal from Iran. Recent material from the Soviet archives seems to indicate that in deciding to take his troops out of Iran, Stalin took into consideration a large number of factors, and not just pressures from the United States or promises from Kazım. Without access to all the deliberations of the Soviet leadership in the days of this decision was made. Oh God. Sorry. When the decision was made, is impossible to measure the relative value and power of each of the factors in shaping Soviet policy. If we believe Stalin's letter to Peshawari, the major reason for his decision to withdraw Soviet forces was that Iran was not ready for a revolution. The Shah believed that American intervention brought about a new stage in U.S.-Soviet relations, writing in his answer to history that it is fair to say that the Cold War began in Iran. Others, like the American consul in Tabriz, have gone even further, suggesting that the Cold War began on March 4, 1946. On that day, 15 Soviet armored brigades began to pour into the northern provinces in Iran. Not accidentally, on March 5th, Churchill delivered his famous speech warning of the rise of a new Iron Curtain around parts of the world. Truman had seen a draft of the address before it was delivered and showed his support for its content when he accepted the job of introducing Churchill to the Fulton, Missouri audience. Not long after the end of the Azerbaijan crisis, the Shah decided to finally rid himself of Hazrat Ashraf, His Eminence. Hazrati Ashraf, His Eminence, a title he himself had bestowed on Kavam in the heat of the Azerbaijan crisis, long after Reza Shah had banned the use of all such titles. The Shah knew he still lacked the independent power base to dismiss Kavam without the support, or at least the tacit approval, of the American, if not British, embassy. As early as March 27, 1947, he told the American embassy about charges of corruption against Kavam that were brought to him daily, and wondered whether he should dismiss the Prime Minister for this reason. The Shah's claim about allegations of corruption was not baseless. Kavam's greed and penchant for bribes and kickbacks was by then widely rumored in Iran, and on occasion reported by foreign governments. But in 1947, the Shah's real goal was not fighting corruption, but soliciting the American embassy's support for removing Kavam. The American ambassador, George Allen, clearly understood what the Shah meant, but the United States still did not want Kavam removed, and thus Allen responded that the responsibility for removing or sustaining the government would be placed on the Majlis. The Shah, too, understood what the ambassador's response implied, but he was not deterred and continued his effort to dismiss Kavam. In this endeavor, the uprising of southern tribes against Kavam inadvertently helped the Shah. Tribal leaders objected to the membership of communists in Kavam's cabinet. Kavam had no choice but to comply with their wishes, but dismissing the communist members of his government would dissipate any remaining support he had on the left. With the right already against him and solidly in the Shah's camp, Kavam was now clearly vulnerable, and the Shah knew this. By mid-October, the American embassy had also changed its mind on Kavam. The State Department instructed its embassy in Tehran to give all appropriate support to any government the Shah appointed to replace Kavam. By October 16th, there was a rumor in Tehran that the Shah had ordered the arrest of Kavam. The once all-powerful Prime Minister, who had dismissed the Shah as a novice, was now worried enough to visit some of the generals close to the Shah that day to find out what the true situation was. The generals were not very helpful, claiming ignorance of the Shah's plans. Yet they added to Kavam's anxieties by saying that what they did know was that the Shah was disgusted with the cabinet's pro-Soviet orientation. Even before the encounter, Kavam had confided to some of his supporters that he was primarily afraid of Iranian army. The army, Kavem knew, was fully in the Shah's camp, anxious about his fate, and now chastened Kavem asked to meet with the Shah on October 17th. By then, the Shah had, in his own words, spent 3 sleepless nights trying to decide whether the time to fire Kavem had finally arrived. According to the Shah, Kavem was trembling with fright when he arrived at the court. With anger in his voice and agitation in his movements, the Shah demanded that members of the Tudeh party and Mozaffar Firuz must be dismissed. Left with few options, Kavem agreed to reshuffle the cabinet and rid it of communist members. But on Firuz he offered a compromise. Instead of firing him, he would send him to Russia as Iran's ambassador. The Shah agreed, but later confided to a friend that he had accepted the idea of sending Firuz to Moscow only because Iranian ambassadors were always treated like dogs by the Kremlin. By the end of the meeting, Kavem and the Shah drew up a new cabinet list, but the Shah had one last demand. He wanted Kavem to keep the decision to fire the communist ministers a secret for 24 hours and announce it to the media as a fait accompli. This way, the Tudeh party would have no chance to try and preempt the reshuffle by organizing demonstrations, and the Soviets would have no opportunity to make new threats. Kavem agreed to the Shah's demand, but no sooner had he left the court than he promptly told Firuz, who told Soviet ambassador. As expected, Russia immediately reacted angrily to the plan, making new threats. Kavem tried to use the threat to frighten the Shah into accepting another delay in their planned reshuffle. Lest the Soviet troops might enter the country, the Shah did not relent. Moreover, the American embassy had by then already assured the Shah that in the case of a Soviet attack, the United States would be there to help. More crucially, the Shah knew that getting rid of the communists in the cabinet would both endear him to the Truman administration and become the necessary first step in getting rid of Kavem. A few weeks later, the Shah was ready to make his final move. His twin sister, Princess Ashraf, was an active partner in the effort. It had taken the Shah a few months to line up the votes in the Majlis and convince Kavem's once powerful allies, and even members of his cabinet, to move against him, to solicit the crucial help of the parliament and its powerful speaker, Sardar Fakhr Husseini. Sardar Fakhr Hekmat. The Shah had, according to the British Embassy, helped pay off the speaker's hefty gambling debts. On December 4th, 1947, to Kavem's utter surprise, all but one member of his cabinet suddenly resigned. He had become particularly vulnerable a few weeks earlier when his proposed bill to offer concessions to the Soviet Union was defeated in the parliament. Even then, he had tried in vain to delay the vote on the proposed concessions. The Shah and the Speaker, showing what the American embassy called statesmanlike behavior and patriotism, had worked behind the scenes and away from the watching eyes of Kavem and his allies to defeat the bill and reject the proposal delay. The American embassy helped the process by promising protection to Iran in case of a Soviet attack. The fact that Kavem had used his powers as prime minister to ensure that a majority of the Majlis were from his newly established Democratic Party of Iran, a party much in the tradition of populist organizations with their uniforms, party songs, and mass demonstrations as a sign of their invincible power, turned out to be of no help. Many of Kavem's acolytes had changed their minds by the time of the vote, particularly after the insistent intervention of Princess Ashraf. The oil concession bill's defeat could have led to a crisis, particularly between Iran and the Soviet Union, making it impossible to dismiss Kazim. Much to the Shah's relief, the Russians were not keen on creating such a crisis. He believed that Stalin showed no reaction to the major setback because the Berlin question needed all of his attention, and victories by Mao Zedong's forces offered the hope of even bigger Soviet gains in China. Kazim had a hard time accepting defeat. In a gesture that bordered between defiance and quixotic delusions of grandeur, even after the massive resignation of his cabinet, he showed up in the Majlis the next day to be met with the further humiliation of a vote of no confidence. In his farewell speech, he declared that history would absolve him and reveal him his many patriotic services to the country. Before long, fearing for his safety, he left Iran for Paris, where he waited for the next round in his shadowboxing match with the Shah. It took something of a miracle that there even was such a next round.